The first rule they teach you in the academy isn't about drawing your sidearm or reading Miranda rights. It's about the sound. In this job, Sergeant Ramirez, a man whose voice sounded like gravel and regret, would bark. The silence will mess with your head more than the screaming ever will. My name is Officer Ben Carter. I was a third-generation cop in the small, painfully normal town of Havenwood, Maine. My father and grandfather both wore the badge. They had seen drunk drivers, domestic disputes, and the occasional lost hiker. They had never seen anything like the call that came in at 3:17 on a Tuesday, an hour when the air itself feels dead. The call came from the old Kellar farm, 3 miles outside of town limits, a place everyone knew was empty. The Kellar family had died out decades ago, a slow, quiet attrition that left the huge, gray farmhouse to rot in the fog. The dispatcher, a rookie named Sarah who sounded like she was chewing on her headset, was clearly terrified. Her voice was thin and reedy. Officer Carter, responding to 142, Kellar Road. Caller reported, sustained, abnormal vocalizations. No other details. Caller hung up. You're closest, go check it out. Abnormal vocalizations. That was the official term for screaming that I drove the old Crown Vic up the long, unpaved driveway. The headlights cut through a fog so thick it felt like driving through milk. The house appeared suddenly, a skeletal ruin against the gray. Its windows were dark, like empty eye sockets. The real chill hit me when I stepped out of the car. It wasn't the main air, it was the silence. Ramirez was wrong. The silence was far worse than any sound. There were no crickets, no wind rustling the dead leaves, not even the hum of distant power lines. Just absolute, suffocating dead air. My own footsteps on the gravel sounded obscenely loud that I approached the porch. The front door was slightly ajar, invitingly so, despite the heavy chain and padlocks I knew the town had placed on it years ago. No sign of forced entry, no splintered wood. It was as if the locks had simply unlatched themselves that I drew my flashlight and my sidearm. Havenwood PD. Is anyone in here? The words felt like stones leaving my mouth, swallowed instantly by the void. The light beam cut into the foyer, a swirling cloud of dust and mildew. The air inside was freezing, but thick, like something had recently been exhaled. The floorboards were bare, the walls stripped. Then I heard it. It wasn't a scream, not exactly. It was a recording. From upstairs, faint but clear, a loop of sound played. A child's high-pitched giggling, followed by a woman's calm, measured voice reading what sounded like a bedtime story. And then, a quick, sharp, wet snap. Then the whole loop started over. Giggling. Story. Snap. Giggling. Story. Snap. It was horrifying, but in an unsettling, clinical way. It was too pristine, too perfect a loop for any kind of natural chaos that I moved up the main staircase, the wood groaning beneath my boots. The sounds grew louder, seeming to emanate from the master bedroom at the end of the hall. As I reached the top landing, I noticed something strange on the wall. A small, almost imperceptible discoloration in the dust. I ran my gloved hand over it. It wasn't dust. It was a perfectly straight line, cut deep into the plaster, running horizontally across the wall at about chest height. It was the same on the opposite wall. A terrible, cold premonition slid into my gut. This wasn't a break-in. This wasn't a prank. I kicked the bedroom door in. The recording abruptly cut off. The room was bare except for a single object in the center. A sleek, black, modern-looking digital recorder resting on the floor. It was running a red light, indicating it was paused. It looked utterly out of place, like a futuristic relic in this tomb of a room. I holstered my weapon and crouched down, flashlight beam fixed on the device. I hesitated, then reached out to pick it up. That's when I saw the second object. Tucked beneath the digital recorder was a single piece of crisp, folded paper. I unfolded it. It wasn't a note or a confession. It was a professional, high-quality photograph, the kind of heavy stock used for crime scene evidence. The photo was a color image of the bedroom I was standing in now, taken from the exact perspective of the doorway. But in the photo, the room was not empty. In the center, where the recorder lay now, stood a man, not the original owner, not a vagrant, but a stranger in a heavy black coat. He was looking directly into the camera, a wide, unnervingly delighted smile splitting his face. And in his hands, he was holding a severed, perfectly preserved human ear, But the real gut punch, the thing that instantly brought the bile to my throat and shattered my composure, was what was on the wall behind him in the photo. There, drawn neatly in a viscous, dark substance, not paint, was a single, crudely rendered symbol, a complex knot of lines I didn't recognize, and beneath the symbol, written in a stark, block print font that seemed to leap off the page and into my mind, were two words: "You're late." I dropped the photo, my flashlight clattering to the floor. The beam rolled, illuminating the bare wall behind where the man had stood in the image. The wall was still bare. The symbol was not there, but the horizontal cut line, the one I had touched outside, was here too, running behind the spot where the photo showed the man's head. And the dust beneath it was disturbed, revealing a small, dark smear. A single, minuscule drop of something dark, and WET.my radio crackled to life, making me jump half a foot. It was Sarah, the dispatcher, her voice strained. "Officer Carter, report on scene status. I'm getting a second call from Kellar Road. Different voice, but it's the same address." I scrambled for my radio, heart hammering against my ribs, convinced I was about to hear the killer on the line. "Negative. Sarah, what are they saying?" "Patch them through." I can't, sir." They hung up before I could connect. But before they did, they just played a sound into the phone. A recording. There was a heavy pause on the line, and then Sarah whispered a single, terrifying phrase. "Officer Carter." It was a child giggling, a woman reading a story, and then a snap. I stood there in the freezing, dead air of the Kellar farmhouse bedroom, the weight of the digital recorder in my hand suddenly feeling like an anchor forged in bad intentions. The silence had returned, thick and absolute, broken only by Sarah's frantic breathing over the radio. "Sarah, repeat that," I ordered, my voice sounding unnaturally high, the adrenaline spiking through the weariness of the late shift. I looked at the dark smear on the wall, the single drop beneath the strange horizontal cut. Was it blood? It smelled metallic, yes, but also faintly of ozone, like a high-tension wire had just shorted out. "The call, Officer Carter," Sarah managed, her composure fraying. "It came in on a burner phone, untraceable. All they did was hold the receiver to a speaker, playing that same loop. Giggling, the story, the snap. I checked the logs. It's the exact sequence the first caller reported. And they called from 142, Kellar Road again, sir. Right now. But there was no one else here. The yard was empty. My car was the only vehicle on the property. I pressed the record button on the device I held, hoping to play back the horrific loop and confirm it, but the memory bank was empty. Totally blank. No giggling, no story, no snap. Just an empty black box. I clipped the recorder to my belt, my eyes scanning the room for anything else. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, save for my own boot prints leading to the recorder. There was no back window, no hidden passage. Whoever took that photo, whoever made that second call, they were either moving faster than humanly possible, or they had never been here at all. I took the photograph again, the image of the smiling man and the severed ear. I turned the photo over. Nothing. No print date, no identifying marks. Just a picture that shouldn't exist, a perfect record of a crime scene that had been immediately and surgically sterilized. I radioed back to Sarah. "I'm clearing the scene now. Tell dispatch to send CSI and 2 uniforms. Do not let them touch anything outside until I get back. I'm bringing the evidence, a photo and a digital recorder, to the station." "Understood, Officer Carter. Please hurry." The drive back to Havenwood felt like traversing a different dimension. The fog was still impenetrable, clinging to the windows. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man from the photo riding in the back seat, still smiling. Back at the station, the fluorescent lights of the Havenwood Police Department were harsh and unforgiving, washing out the color from everything, including the dread on my face. Captain Elias Vance, a man who believed every mystery could be solved by paperwork and persistence, met me in the hall. Vance was a career cop, rigid and logical. He took one look at my expression and the photograph in my hand, and his skepticism vanished. I laid the photo and the digital recorder on a clean table in the evidence room. I explained the strange locks, the chilling audio loop, the unsettling symbol in the picture, and the impossible second call. Vance leaned over the photograph, his brow furrowed. "This man, Carter, you recognize him?" "No, sir. I've never seen him." But that ear, it looks like it was removed with surgical precision. And the symbol behind him. Vance picked up a magnifying glass and examined the dark substance of the symbol in the photo. It's high definition. This photo is brand new. But the symbol, it looks like it was drawn in charcoal or maybe old printer ink. Then, his gaze fell upon the two words beneath the symbol. You're late. Late for what? Vance muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. A message? A warning? A game? I pointed to the digital recorder. The key, Captain, is this. Sarah heard the recording over the phone. But the device is empty. And that second call came in while I was in the house, saying the exact same thing. Vance spent the next 2 hours on the phone with the state police tech unit, the call center logs, and the phone company. The results were chillingly consistent. The first call was a ghost, a brief, anonymous connection that provided the audio and immediately disconnected. The second call, the one Sarah confirmed while I was inside, was even worse. The state guys confirmed it, Vance said, walking back into the evidence room, his face pale. The second call came from a number that doesn't exist. It was a digital composite, an impossible signal that spoofed the cell tower nearest the Kellar farm. It originated from a dead zone, Carter. It's like the call was made from outside the network. But the real development came when a younger officer, Dana Miller, walked in, holding a small evidence bag. Sir? Captain Vance, Officer Carter. I checked the perimeter of the Kellar property, like you asked. Near the old well, tucked under a loose stone, I found this. In the bag was another piece of paper. It wasn't a photograph. It was a hand-drawn diagram. It was a sketch of a map of Havenwood, drawn with incredible detail, marking every street and every back alley. But what made my blood run cold was the small red X marked on the map. The X was placed precisely over the Havenwood Police Department, and beneath the X, written in the same stark, block print font from the photograph, were 3 new words. Not a warning, not a threat, but a command. Turn it on. I looked at the map, then at the empty, silent digital recorder sitting on the table. The recording, Captain, I said, a terrible realization dawning. Maybe it's not empty. Maybe it's just not accessible through the normal buttons. Vance stared at the recorder, then back at the map targeting our station. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Do it, Carter, Vance ordered, his voice low and heavy. Find a way to turn it on. I grabbed the recorder. It was sleek, seamless. No obvious external ports or screws. I ran my thumb over the casing, searching for a hidden switch. My thumb snagged on a tiny, almost invisible indentation on the side. I pressed it. The small red light on the device turned a sickly, unsettling green. And then, the voice. It wasn't the woman's voice from the loop. It wasn't the child's giggling. It was a man's voice, smooth, resonant, and chillingly familiar. The voice of the smiling man in the photographed IT came through the small speaker, filling the evidence room with an intimate, casual tone, as if he were discussing the weather. Welcome back, Ben. You found the initiation key. Excellent. The time for static is over. You're not just an officer anymore. You're part of the Echo Protocol, and we have a lot of lost material to recover. He paused, a faint, satisfied sigh audible over the speaker. I need you to look at the photo again, Ben. The horizontal line, the smear, that is not a cut. That is the first extraction point. I've left the next one for you. Get there fast. You're running out of time. The recording stopped. The green light blinked twice, then turned off completely. I looked at Vance, who was staring at me, his face the color of old cement. He knows my name. I breathed, staring at the inert black box. He knows I was the one who responded, and he knows exactly where to find me next. I didn't need the man's instructions to find the next location. I didn't need the map. My eyes were already drawn to the second object that had been placed strategically in the evidence bag, along with the map. It was a key. An old, brass key, heavy and cold. It was clearly antique, and I recognized the style instantly. It was the key to the iron gate of the Havenwood Town Hall clock tower, a place that had been sealed for 40 years. Captain Vance gripped the brass key, his knuckles white. The key was heavy, tarnished with age, and felt impossibly cold even in the overheated station. The Town Hall clock tower, Vance said, his voice barely a rasp. It's been locked since '85. Maintenance issues, they said. Too dangerous. I didn't need a maintenance report to know it was dangerous now. The key was a direct invitation from a killer who knew my name, had somehow tracked my movements, and was now dictating my investigation. "We have to go, Captain," I said, already grabbing my coat and checking my sidearm. He told me I was running out of time, and he called that line on the photo an extraction point. We don't know what he extracted, but if he's doing it again, we need to stop him. Vance nodded grimly. He knew that calling in state police or the FBI now would mean explaining an untraceable call, a blank recorder, a cryptic photo, and a mysterious key, a story that would get me, and possibly him, sent for psychological evaluation before a search warrant was issued. We were in this alone. The town hall loomed over Havenwood, a massive, gray stone structure that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel. The clock tower was its crown, tall, narrow, and silent, its hands perpetually frozen at 11:57. We found the iron gate to the service stairs beneath the tower. It was rusty, secured by a heavy, old-fashioned padlock that hadn't been touched in decades. The antique key slid into the lock as smoothly as if it had been lubricated yesterday. Click. The heavy tumblers turned effortlessly as we ascended the winding stone staircase in absolute darkness, using only our flashlights. The air was colder than outside, thick with the smell of old machinery, dust, and something else, a faint, oily scent, almost like diesel. The climb felt endless. Every footfall echoed on the stone, the noise magnified by the cylinder of the tower. When we finally reached the main clock mechanism level, our beams cut into a nightmare of gears, thick cables, and brass weights. "Jesus," Vance muttered, breathing hard. "Looks like a tomb in here." But it wasn't the machinery that drew our attention. It was the center of the room, exactly where the heavy brass pendulum should have been swinging, suspended on a chain, was a new item. It was a metal, cylindrical container, about the size of a fire extinguisher, painted matte black. It was fastened to the chain with high-tensile zip ties. Attached to the container was a small, laminated card. On the card, written in the same block print font, were the words, "The Lost Echo." And beneath it, scrawled in a frantic, hurried handwriting that looked entirely different. "Don't open it, Ben." My heart seized in my chest. The last warning was handwritten, desperate, and personal. Someone else had been here. Someone who knew the killer's victim was me. Vance drew his weapon and pointed it at the container. "Who wrote that, Carter? Is there anyone else up here?" I shook my head, my eyes darting into the shadows of the gears. "No, Captain. It's empty. But someone was here before us. They left this warning." We carefully cut the zip ties and lowered the container. It was heavy, and it wasn't empty. We laid it on a dusty workbench covered in cobwebs. Vance took out his multi-tool, carefully examining the top. "There's a pressure release valve. Looks highly pressurized. Could be anything. Nerve agent, explosives, or lost material, Captain," I countered, the voice of the man on the tape ringing in my ears. "The killer wanted this opened. The warning told me not to." My gut screamed for caution, but then Vance noticed something on the side of the container. A small, built-in digital screen, no bigger than a watch face that IT was counting down. 00:05:43. "He's forced our hand," Vance gritted out, tossing the multi-tool on the bench. "We don't have time for a bomb squad. If it's a gas, we're already breathing it. If it's a bomb, running won't help. We have to know what's inside. We have to understand what we're fighting." With shaking hands, I took the container and slowly turned the release valve. There was a hiss, not of gas, but of pressure equalizing. I carefully lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dry ice, was not a bomb or gas. It was a single item, glowing faintly with a cold, pale green light that IT was a perfectly smooth, black glass orb, about the size of a baseball. It hummed slightly, the sound nearly lost in the background noise of the old clockwork. It looked alien, impossible. As I reached for it, the sound of the clock tower changed. The old, silent mechanism suddenly shuddered. The giant gears, frozen for 40 years, began to move. Clunk, clunk, clunk. The clock hands outside started moving rapidly, catching up to the current time, spinning and clicking with terrifying speed. The sudden movement sent dust raining down around us. Then, from the darkness above the gears, a mechanical, echoing voice boomed, synchronized with the movement of the clock. It wasn't the killer's voice, but the automated chime of the clock tower itself. The retrieval is complete. Target Ben Carter. Initiated. The sound was so loud, so unexpected, that we both stumbled back. I looked at the black glass orb in my hand. It was vibrating now, and the pale green light intensified. Vance pointed his flashlight frantically at the largest gear, a brass wheel the size of a car tire. Carter, look! Impossibly, one of the thick, steel pins holding the main spring was rotating. It wasn't supposed to move. As it rotated, it exposed an inscription that had been hidden beneath the metal for decades. It was the exact, complex knot of lines, the symbol, that we had seen drawn in blood-like substance on the photograph back at the Kellar farm. The last fraction of the symbol was revealed. The glass orb in my hand suddenly pulsed with blinding light, and a new sound filled the tower, cutting through the grinding machinery. A woman's terrified, piercing scream. It wasn't a recording this time. It was raw, immediate, and utterly real. It sounded like it was coming from inside the orb. And then, the voice of the smiling killer, cold and pleased, cut through the scream, echoing off the stone walls. It wasn't coming from a speaker. It sounded like it was being whispered directly into my inner ear. That was the second echo, Ben. A memory. An awareness. Now the protocol is active. Go to the third extraction point. The one place in Havenwood where the veil is thinnest. Where the forgotten rest. You know the place. The tower went completely dark and silent again, plunged into absolute, oppressive stillness. The scream was gone. The clock hand stopped, now precisely at the current time. 04:51 a.m. I dropped the glowing orb. As it hit the dusty wooden bench, it shattered into a million fragments of black glass, and the cold green light vanished, leaving nothing but a faint smell of ozone and sulfur. Carter, what was that place? Vance demanded, his flashlight beam shaking violently. Where is the third extraction point? I looked down at the shattered remains of the orb. I didn't need a map or a new key. The killer was right. I knew the place. The only place in Havenwood where the forgotten truly rest, where the veil between the normal and the unspeakable was thinnest, was the old Havenwood Cemetery. The old Havenwood Cemetery was less a place of rest and more a preserved ruin. Established in the mid-1700s, it lay far down a winding, overgrown service road, its gates rusted open and its fieldstone walls crumbling. It was a dense, dark forest of tilting slate tombstones and choked ivy, where the air was perpetually colder and stiller than anywhere else in town. Vance and I drove slowly, the Crown Vic's headlights cutting shaky cones through the cemetery's massive, ancient trees. The fog hadn't lifted. Here, it felt like a heavy, cold blanket pressed down by the weight of 2 centuries of dead. The place where the veil is thinnest, Vance muttered, chewing on the killer's words. He's not talking about police procedure, Carter. He's talking about folklore. Something dark. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of movement, but the only shapes were the grim, shadowed outlines of mausoleums and monuments. The killer knew my name, knew my history, and was directing me like a puppet on a string. The Echo Protocol was less a procedure and more a terrifying, personalized scavenger hunt. The orb, I said, my voice low. When it shattered, it released a scream, Captain, not a recording. It was an echo of a sound that happened somewhere else, maybe a long time ago. He's collecting these echoes. And the first echo was at Kellar Farm, Vance countered, where a family died years ago. And the second was in the clock tower, silent for 40 years. He paused. What happened in this cemetery that was loud enough to leave an echo? We reached the center path, where a cluster of the oldest stones lay beneath the canopy of an immense, dead oak tree. The air here was almost painfully cold, and the beam of my flashlight picked up faint, geometric patterns on the ground, circles and lines that looked like they had been scraped into the hard dirt. They were faint, but deliberate, and then we saw it. The third extraction point. It was a grave, old, forgotten, with a tombstone so weathered the name was entirely illegible. It was set apart from the others, surrounded by a low, circular wall of loose stones. On top of the tombstone lay the third piece of evidence. It was another digital device, identical to the one I had found at the Kellar farm, sleek, black, and utterly sterile. It was running a flashing blue light this time. But this time, the killer had left more than a note, Sticking out of the soil at the head of the grave was a makeshift wooden stake, and impaled upon that stake was a small, white, child-sized doll. Its porcelain face was cracked, and one of its glass eyes was missing. Draped over the doll was a miniature police uniform jacket, perfectly tailored, complete with a tiny, silver Havenwood PD badge pinned to the lapel. That it was a direct, chilling taunt directed at my family's history in Havenwood law enforcement. Vance's hand instinctively went to his holster. He's here. He has to be close. We circled the grave, flashlights sweeping the shadows, but the deep woods around the cemetery remained silent. That I moved to the tombstone and picked up the digital device. Its screen displayed a single, looping word, play. Before I could, Vance grabbed my arm, pointing his light at the ground near the base of the grave. Look, Carter, the soil. It wasn't just soft dirt. The entire grave was covered in a layer of loose, damp soil, despite the area being parched by a recent drought. It looked like it had been freshly disturbed and recently filled in. This grave has been dug up, I whispered, and reburied. He was here tonight. I felt the sudden, awful necessity of listening to the device. I pressed the play button. The blue light turned solid green, and the sound came. It wasn't a scream or a giggle. That it was a low, resonant hum. The sound was deep, almost subsonic, and it vibrated in my chest cavity more than my ears. It grew steadily louder, a rising, sustained tone that felt like pressure building behind my eyes. And then, the voice of the smiling man, the killer, overlaid the hum. The third echo, Ben. Pure frequency. I need awareness and sound to calibrate the vessel. The Kellar farm gave us the memory. The clock tower gave us the frequency. The cemetery gives us the resonance. The humming stopped abruptly. The green light died. The device went silent. Vance was breathing hard. Resonance. What in God's name is he doing? Suddenly, the ground beneath our feet began to vibrate. Not just the grave, but the entire section of the cemetery. The tombstones around us began to shift, grating stone against stone. The heavy, dead branches of the oak tree above us began to sway violently. Despite the absolute lack of wind, that I looked down at the freshly disturbed grave. The soil was actively settling, sinking down in the middle. A new sound began, a horrific, scratching, tearing noise, coming from directly beneath the soil. It was the sound of a large, heavy object being dragged or pulled rapidly through the earth. I backed up quickly, pulling Vance with me, my eyes glued to the sinking grave. The killer's voice returned, not from the device, but from the air around us, a distorted, multi-layered whisper that seemed to come from every shadow, every rustling leaf. The vessel is ready, Ben. The protocol is stabilized. Now for the extraction. Your grandfather's awareness was the hardest to collect, but his duty was commendable. The name on the tombstone, impossible to read before, seemed to suddenly grow darker, the carving gaining definition in the dim light. I could now clearly make out the block letters. Peter E. Carter. HPD. End of watch. 1968. The MY grandfather. The silence, the dark smear, the horizontal line. The first extraction point at Kellar Farm. It had all been a diversion. The killer was after something buried here. The tearing sound intensified, and a section of the freshly laid soil at the foot of my grandfather's grave suddenly ripped open. It wasn't a body clawing its way out. It was a section of a concrete slab, pulled upward by an unseen force. As the slab tilted, Vance shined his light into the exposed hole. Inside, resting on a velvet cushion, was a third and final object. It was an old-fashioned, leather-bound police journal. It was the journal my father always told me my grandfather, Peter Carter, kept in his final years on the force. A journal that went missing after his death in 1968, the year the clock tower was sealed. Before we could move, a new figure stepped out of the fog, walking from behind the massive oak tree. He was tall, dressed in a heavy black coat, with the unervingly wide, delighted smile from the photograph. The smiling killer that he wasn't running. He was taking slow, deliberate steps toward us, his hands empty. Officer Carter, he said, his voice smooth and pleasant, but edged with a terrible finality. The journal contains the final, fourth echo. The intention. Give it to me, or the protocol will activate on a randomized target in this town. Your call. I raised my sidearm, aiming dead center. Vance did the same. Stop right there. Havenwood police. Hands in the air. Vance bellowed, his voice echoing through the silent woods. The killer stopped 10 feet away. He simply smiled wider, completely unafraid of the 2 muzzle flashes aimed at his chest. Too late for orders, Captain. The journal is the key to the next phase. And without it, the truth about Havenwood stays buried. He suddenly moved, not toward the grave, but toward me, with a speed that defied physics. I fired. Blam. The sound was deafening, but the killer didn't flinch. The bullet didn't penetrate him. Instead, it hit an invisible, shimmering barrier in the air around him, generating a flash of pale green light, the same color as the orb. The bullet flattened and fell harmlessly to the ground. The killer was now inches from me, his eyes wide and black. He didn't touch me. He just leaned in, his breath a puff of ozone-smelling air. "You're the vessel, Ben," he whispered, his smile twisting into something predatory. "You've collected the pieces. The protocol is you." And then he vanished. Not ran, not faded. He was simply gone, leaving only the faint scent of sulfur and a lingering chill. That I stood there, weapon still raised, looking at the spot where the bullet had harmlessly rebounded. The ground had stopped shaking. The silence returned. That I lowered my weapon and stumbled to the grave, reaching down and snatching the old leather journal. As my fingers closed around the cold, stiff cover, I felt a familiar, deep vibration, the low, humming resonance from the second echo. That I flipped the journal open. The pages were yellowed, covered in my grandfather's neat, archaic handwriting. The last entry was dated the day before his end of watch. The final page wasn't a diary entry. It was a single, detailed sketch, drawn with professional precision. It was an anatomical drawing of a human brain, and over the center of the brain, drawn in thick, dark ink, was the same complex, geometric symbol that had been on the clock tower gear and the Kellar farm photo. Beneath the drawing, in my grandfather's hand, was a final, damning instruction. "The only way to contain the echo is to use the vessel. Ben, you have to find the source. You have to find the lighthouse." The silence of the cemetery was shattered only by our ragged breaths and the distant, slow ticking of the town hall clock, which had apparently decided to resume its schedule. The encounter with the smiling man, the impossibility of the bullet's failure, and the revelation that the man knew my full name and role had left me vibrating with a mix of fear and blinding rage. I clutched my grandfather's journal, its pages warm now from the internal vibration, the faint humming resonance still palpable. Vance, equally shaken, was examining the flattened, scarred bullet lodged beneath the massive oak root. "That wasn't a bulletproof vest, Carter," Vance said, kicking a piece of dirt over the spent copper slug. "That was a wall. He built a wall of something instantly." He called himself the protocol's organizer. I corrected, flipping through the cryptic final pages of the journal. "And he called me the vessel. This isn't just a serial killer, Captain. He's connected to something big, something that uses sound and memory." I showed Vance the final page, the anatomical sketch of the brain with the complex symbol drawn over the cortex. "This is the intention, Captain. The fourth echo. Why would a cop sketch a brain?" Vance took the journal, his eyes narrowing as he scanned my grandfather's neat handwriting above the sketch point 10/11/68. "They won't believe me. The sounds are not residual. They are harvested. They are being stored, waiting for release. The ritual requires 4 elements: memory, Kellar, frequency, tower, resonance, cemetery, and intention, the mind. The protocol is ready to activate. The only way to contain the echo is to use the vessel. Ben, you have to find the source. You have to find the lighthouse. Your grandfather was investigating this 50 years ago," Vance breathed, his voice heavy with disbelief. "And he sealed the clock tower because of this. He didn't die of natural causes, did he, Carter? That end of watch date? I didn't need him to finish the thought. My father always said Peter Carter died in a car accident on a dark, foggy road. Now, looking at the symbols, the impossible defense, and the journal, I knew that was a cover story or a convenience. The lighthouse, Captain," I said, pointing to the final word. "There's only one. The old Havenwood lighthouse, on the cliffs north of the harbor. It's decommissioned, locked up tight." Vance didn't hesitate this time. "Let's go. If this protocol is about to activate, and your grandfather spent his last days trying to stop it, We're going to finish his job. The drive to the lighthouse was short, maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. The fog was relentless, clinging to the coastal road like a shroud. The lighthouse was a grim sentinel of black and white granite, perched precariously on a sheer cliff face overlooking the churning, unseen Atlantic. As we parked, the roar of the surf was loud, a constant, heavy rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of the land. The iron door at the base of the tower was massive, sealed with 3 large, industrial-grade padlocks. Impossible to open without heavy-duty cutting tools. "We need to get the bolt cutters from the trunk," Vance said, moving toward the car, but as I approached the door, I noticed something stuck in the central, oldest padlock. It was a slip of paper. I pulled it out. Written in the killer's familiar blockprint font was a single word, followed by a direction. "Intention, press." I looked down at my hand. I was still clutching my grandfather's journal. The journal was the intention. "He's giving us the key," I whispered, holding up the note. "The last echo is the physical key." I tentatively pressed the stiff, leather-bound journal against the heavy, cold brass of the padlock. There was no sound, no click. Instead, a wave of the same unsettling, pale green light emanated from the journal, washing over the padlock. The brass of the lock seemed to ripple, to become momentarily fluid. Then, with a slow, grinding sound, all 3 padlocks simultaneously disintegrated into piles of fine, gray dust. The door swung inward with a mournful, heavy creak, revealing a central spiral staircase that plunged into absolute darkness. "The journal isn't a key, Carter," Vance said, staring at the dust. "It's a trigger. Your grandfather imbued it with an intent to stop this thing, and the killer is using that intent to open the way." We started our ascent. The interior of the lighthouse was nothing like the maintenance-free stillness of the clock tower. It was humid, hot, and smelled strongly of sulfur, stale seawater, and burning metal. As we climbed, the heat increased, and the air grew thick with a subtle, electric charge. Halfway up the hundreds of stairs, we found our first clue that this wasn't a standard, abandoned lighthouse. Scrawled crudely on the wall, in what looked like dried oil or blood, was a single, long-forgotten name, carved deeply into the granite. Unless Vance stopped cold. He ran his hand over the carving, his face pale. "That's my father's name," he said, his voice barely a breath. "Elias Vance. He was harbor master here for 30 years. He died in '85, the same year they sealed the clock tower." The revelation was a punch to the gut. The killer wasn't just targeting my lineage. He was targeting the founding families of Havenwood's authority, the police and the harbor master. He was systematically dismantling the town's history that we continued to climb, our flashlights now flickering, struggling against the pervasive electric hum in the air. Finally, we reached the top level, the light chamber. The chamber was dominated by the massive Fresnel lens, a complex piece of glass engineering that filled the entire space. But the lens was shattered, not broken into pieces, but pulverized, reduced to a heap of shimmering, glass powder piled on the floor. And in the center of the pile, a new structure had been erected that was a tripod, made of rough, driftwood scavenged from the sea, lashed together with rusty wire. Suspended within the tripod was the fourth and final device that was a cylindrical, metallic vessel, the same matte black as the container in the clock tower, but much larger, humming with a continuous, powerful vibration. It was covered in the same complex, geometric symbol, etched deep into the metal, glowing a pulsing, sickly green. This wasn't just a recorder. This was a machine. The killer was nowhere in sight, but a sound was emanating from the vessel. A familiar, rising hum, amplified to an unbearable volume that drove a sharp, hot pain into my temples. Was the resonance echo, magnified thousands of times. Next to the tripod, resting on the only piece of unbroken glass, was a photograph. I snatched it up, the image instantly searing itself into my memory. Was a picture of the smiling man, standing right here, in this chamber, holding the completed vessel. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to him, his arm draped casually over the killer's shoulder, was a much younger, uniformed Captain Vance, smiling proudly into the camera. "Captain," I gasped, holding out the impossible photo. "What is this?" Vance took the photo. His face went utterly slack, emptied of all emotion. "That's not me," he whispered, staring at his younger doppelganger standing with the killer. "That's my brother, Silas. He disappeared in the mid-90s. They said he ran off." The killer was manipulating not just my past, but Vance's as well. The metallic vessel suddenly screamed, a sound that wasn't sound at all, but pure agony. It stopped the humming and replaced it with 1,000 voices speaking at once, all layered over each other in an overwhelming, manic torrent of whispering. The echoes were being released, and then the voice of the smiling man cut through the chaos, not whispered, but broadcast from the vessel with cold authority. "Vessel online. Phase 2 initiated. Ben Carter, the next extraction point is personal. Your house. Come home, officer. I'm waiting for the final echo." I looked down at the photo in my hand. Captain Vance's missing brother and the smiling killer that I looked at the vessel, now pouring out a terrifying flood of chaotic sound. And I looked at Captain Vance, who was staring blankly at the picture of his missing brother and the killer. He looked less like a cop and more like a ghost. "Captain," I tried, reaching for him. "We have to go? He's at my house." Vance didn't respond. He simply reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an object I hadn't seen before. A small, antique, metal bell, tarnished with verdigris. It was the ceremonial bell that used to hang in the harbor master's office. He looked at the picture of his brother, then at the screaming vessel, and a terrifying, cold resolve hardened his features. "My brother didn't run away, Carter," Vance said, his voice now flat and lethal. "He was part of this, and he didn't disappear. He was simply reassigned." He didn't look at me again. He simply took the harbor master's bell, raised it high over the metallic vessel, and brought it down with crushing force. Clang. The bell fractured the metallic hull of the vessel. The torrent of voices immediately stopped. A wave of pale green light surged out of the crack, momentarily blinding me. The last thing I saw was Vance, standing amidst the fading green light, looking right at me, his eyes filled with immense regret. "Go home, Ben," he ordered, his voice echoing with the authority of every officer who had ever worn the badge. "Finish the job." Then, the final surge of green light engulfed the top of the lighthouse. When my vision cleared, the vessel, the tripod, and Captain Vance were gone. Only the shattered glass and the heavy, metallic smell remained that I stood alone in the silence. The lighthouse light chamber sealed once more, the key to the next phase, the final echo, waiting for me at my own front door. The descent from the lighthouse was a blur of adrenaline and disbelief. I ran down the winding staircase, my mind reeling from the sight of Captain Vance disappearing in that blinding green light. He had sacrificed himself, or perhaps been consumed by whatever force Silas and the killer were working for. His final words, "Finish the job," were a terrifying baton passed across generations that I didn't radio for backup. I knew I couldn't trust anyone at the station, not after the revelation about Vance's brother, Silas, and the systematic targeting of Havenwood's official families. This was no longer a police matter. It was a counter-ritual, and I was the reluctant, terrified vessel. The drive back to my own street was the hardest. Every shadow seemed to hold the smiling man. Every flicker of the streetlights felt like the precursor to the pale green energy that my house stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. A modest, two-story house. Exactly the kind of place a third-generation cop would inherit. It looked utterly normal, utterly safe, under the heavy gray fog. But as I pulled up, I saw the impossible. The front door was open, but not damaged. It was standing ajar, just like the door at the Kellar farm. And resting neatly on my welcome mat was a familiar black device, the fifth and final digital recorder. It was running a solid, malevolent red light that I drew my weapon, the metal cold and heavy in my hand. I approached the door slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The scent of ozone and sulfur was faint here, but present. Before I could reach the door, a sound came from inside the house. Not the man's voice. It was a woman crying, muffled and desperate, damn my wife's voice. "Sarah," I shouted, recognizing the terrified strain. Sarah wasn't just my dispatcher. She was Sarah Vance, Captain Vance's niece, and she was the only person who knew the full timeline of the impossible calls. She must have come to check on me after the last radio silence that I kicked the door wide open and swept the living room with my sidearm. The room was pristine. Nothing broken, nothing moved. Except for the center of the rug, Where the smiling man stood, he was exactly as in the photograph. Tall, elegant, and radiating a cold, unnerving pleasure. He was wearing the same heavy black coat, despite the warmth of the room. He didn't hold a weapon. He held a small, antique, wooden music box, and sitting tied to a kitchen chair, gagged with a piece of black cloth, was Sarah Vance. Her eyes were wide, fixed on me, pleading. "Welcome home, Ben," the man said, his voice soft, almost affectionate. "I knew you'd be punctual. The vessel always responds to intention." I aimed my weapon at his head. "Let her go. Now, you're surrounded." He chuckled, a dry, papery sound. "Surrounded by what, Ben? Your memories? Your duty? The ghost of your grandfather." He tilted his head toward the front door. "Don't bother, the police are busy. Your final call to Sarah was scrambled by the protocol. They're convinced you've gone rogue. It's just you, me, the girl, and the final echo." I pressed the barrel into the light. "Who are you?" "My name is irrelevant," he said, turning the key on the wooden music box. A delicate, tinkling melody began to play. "But you can call me the archivist. And I'm here to complete the reclamation ritual that your grandfather started and your father helped silence." He walked closer to Sarah, still playing the music box. "You see, Ben, the first generation of Havenwood cops, your grandfather, Vance's father, they discovered something. The complex symbol isn't a demon's mark. It's a frequency tuner. Havenwood sits on a rare geological fault that acts like a gigantic antenna for psychic debris, the overwhelming sound and agony of every death and trauma that happens here." He paused, letting the music box melody fill the room. "Your grandfather, Peter Carter, realized he could harvest these psychic residues, these echoes, to clean the town. He built the vessel in the lighthouse. He called it the protocol, but he needed the strongest echoes to power it." The archivist placed the music box on a side table. He targeted the Kellar farm for the memory of the tragedy. He used the silent clock tower for the frequency of his secret work. He dug up his own grave for the resonance of his buried guilt. And he put his intention, the secret, into the journal. For echoes, for sources of power. I kept the gun steady. "Then why kill him? Why silence him?" "He didn't want to use the fourth echo," the archivist replied, picking up the final digital recorder from the mat. "He had all the power he needed, but he realized the final echo had to be the most potent, the sacrifice. He needed a life force, a soul, to stabilize the vessel. He refused." The archivist knelt by Sarah and gently untied the gag. Sarah immediately screamed, her voice hoarse and broken. "The final echo," the archivist announced, holding up the recorder. "The sacrifice. Your father, the second generation, didn't kill your grandfather. He covered up your grandfather's death, trying to hide the journal and the protocol, but his guilt was immense. He became the echo Peter needed. Your grandfather died in that car crash because your father drove him into it, trying to stop him from using the final echo himself. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My father, covering up his own desperate patricide." The archivist looked at the recorder, his smile deepening. "That recorder holds the final echo of your father's last moments. A man confessing his sins to his dying father, the pure agony of the ultimate betrayal. I retrieved that confession from the Crash Crown Vic's internal computer chip, the last, lost material I needed." He pressed the play button on the recorder. The sound that filled the room was my father's voice, choked with tears, saying 3 simple, agonizing words. "I am sorry, Dad." The sound lasted only a second, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. The red light on the recorder flashed violently, then exploded in a puff of smoke. "The protocol is complete," the archivist announced, tossing the now-dead recorder aside. "The vessel, your body, Ben, infused with the intent of the journal, will now hold the entire psychic trauma of this town, allowing it to finally process its dark history." He gestured to Sarah. "I don't need the girl's life. I need her presence. A witness. A pure observer to watch the town's trauma transfer into its current guardian, you." The archivist raised his hands. The air in the room grew instantly frigid, then searing hot. The complex symbol, the frequency tuner, began to shimmer into existence on every wall, every window, glowing a brilliant, horrifying green. The floorboards groaned. The pictures on the wall rattled. And then, the sound began. It wasn't a recording. It was a deafening, terrifying chorus. A million years of Havenwood suffering, all the death, betrayal, and violence, being poured directly into the room, concentrated, aimed at me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head as the psychic storm of noise hit me. The sound was liquid, agonizing, physically pushing me down. I heard the snap of the Kellar farm, the desperate cry of Captain Vance, the screams from the lighthouse, all hitting me at once. Through the wall of sound, the archivist spoke, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "This will hurt, Ben, but you are the vessel. You will hold it all. You will be the echo for the town's silence." I looked up at Sarah, who was watching in horror. I still had the gun. I couldn't fight the archivist. Bullets wouldn't touch him, but I knew what my grandfather did when he was cornered, and what my father had done out of desperation. I knew the final, hidden weakness of the protocol. The archivist was collecting the town's suffering, its echoes, to cleanse Havenwood. But the town itself had one final, forgotten defense. That I raised my gun to the ceiling, aiming where the main power conduit ran. "He's not taking me," I screamed, my voice raw against the psychic noise. "He wants the town's silence. But the town itself has to resist." I squeezed the trigger. Blam! The bullet tore into the electrical conduit. Sparks rained down, the lights went out, and a wave of pure, chaotic electrical feedback ripped through the walls. The power surge acted like a scrambler. The torrent of psychic noise immediately fractured, splintered, and began to dissipate, tearing the green symbols off the walls. The house was plunged into silent, terrifying darkness. The archivist let out a shriek, not of pain, but of profound frustration. "You fool. You broke the connection. You released the echoes." He glared at me, his eyes burning with rage. "You may have won this round, vessel. But the echoes are not contained. They are dispersed. They are now everywhere. And the protocol will continue through the true key." He pointed to the music box on the side table, which was now glowing faintly with a residual green light. "The music box is the frequency anchor. As long as it plays, the echoes will seek their vessel. And you, Ben Carter, are bound to the music. You will spend the rest of your life hunting the sound of your own town's pain." He stepped back, dissolving into the impenetrable darkness and the scent of ozone. The house was silent. I dropped the gun, my body aching with phantom pain. I rushed to Sarah, quickly cutting her bonds. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, pulling her to the door. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. As we stumbled out onto the front lawn, the silence of the cul-de-sac was broken by a single, faint, high-pitched sound, carried on the chilling coastal breeze. It was the delicate, haunting, tinkling melody of the wooden music box. It was playing somewhere in the distance, somewhere in Havenwood. The hunt had begun. The silence of the dawn was a fragile, terrifying thing. It felt less like peace and more like a vacuum waiting to be filled by the next scream. Sarah and I stumbled down the street and straight into the waiting glare of Havenwood PD. The house was now cordoned off with yellow tape, surrounded by cruisers. The power surge at my house, and the simultaneous, massive localized blackout across the north end of town, had finally broken through the protocol's digital shielding. Deputy Chief Howard Jenkins, a man whose career ambition was only matched by his profound lack of imagination, met me at the curb. Jenkins was red-faced, angry, and utterly bewildered. "Carter, what the hell happened? We've got reports of multiple burglaries, a massive power failure, and Captain Vance is missing. He took a cruiser out and hasn't been seen since his last check-in at the lighthouse." I looked at Sarah. Her eyes, wide and hollowed out from fear, held the secret. We had an unspoken agreement. The truth about the archives, the echoes, the smiling man, and Vance's sacrifice was a non-starter. They would lock us up. I gave Jenkins the cover story we had manufactured during the walk. I responded to a suspected break-in. We caught a vagrant who escaped during a surge when the wiring shorted out. He incapacitated Sarah with a chemical spray. He took nothing but left the damaged electrical components. I produced the dead, fried digital recorder from my pocket and handed it over. He was recording something, maybe a confession. It blew up when the power went. Jenkins looked from the recorder to Sarah's terrified face, then to my exhausted, soot-smudged uniform. He didn't believe a word of it, but he had no other option. Vance was missing, and the town was half dark. "Get yourself and Sarah to the hospital, Carter. Psychological evaluation. Standard procedure." You're off duty pending investigation. The vessel awakens brain by midday, after a brief, useless hospital visit and a lengthy, useless interrogation. I was alone in my temporary apartment, mandated sick leave hanging over me like a cloud. Sarah, still shaken, was staying with relatives in the next town. That I sat on the edge of the bed, the antique brass key to the lighthouse gate still heavy in my pocket. I hadn't reported the key, nor my grandfather's journal, which I had hidden in the apartment's air vent. The mandatory rest was impossible. My body felt wrong. The exposure to the combined psychic storm in my living room hadn't just scared me, it had fundamentally changed me. I felt a constant, deep-seated dread, not just fear, but a visceral knowledge of the terrible things that happened in Havenwood. That IT started subtly. I'd be walking down the street, and suddenly, the faint outline of a decades-old car wreck would shimmer over a perfectly normal intersection. I'd be pouring coffee, and I'd smell the sulfur and ozone from the lighthouse. Then came the sound. The faint, tinkling melody of the wooden music box. That IT wasn't external. It was internal, a soft, insistent, almost melodic noise playing inside my skull. It was the frequency anchor the archivist had spoken of, the sound that kept the protocol alive and seeking. That I couldn't locate it. But I knew, with chilling certainty, that the sound was loudest when I was near an echo, a place where a fragment of Havenwood's concentrated trauma had been dispersed and was now clinging to the physical world. The archivist had broken the protocol, and now the town was contaminated. The first echo hunt musical notes around 1600 hours. The music box melody in my head sharpened. It was no longer faint. It was a desperate, almost screaming tune, leading me like a compass needle. The sound was coming from the direction of the old Havenwood High School. That I changed out of my uniform, grabbed the hidden journal, and drove the beaten-up Ford sedan I owned. I couldn't be Officer Carter anymore. I was just Ben, the vessel. The high school was closed for the summer. It was a massive, dark brick fortress from the 1950s. The music box in my head was deafening as I pulled into the empty parking lot. That I followed the intensity of the sound to the back wing, where the old gymnasium and locker rooms were located. The back door was sealed, but my gaze was instantly drawn to a low, rectangular window in the brickwork, covered by a heavy metal grate. The grate was pulled slightly away from the wall, bent by immense, unseen force. That I squeezed through the gap and dropped into the suffocating darkness of a janitor's closet. The air here was heavy with the smell of mold, bleach, and something metallic, like old, drying blood. The music box tune was agonizing here, so loud it felt like drilling into my eardrum. I followed the sound through a maze of dusty hallways until I reached the closed, heavy door of the old archery range. That I pushed the door open. The room was dark, lined with old, worn targets. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight cutting through a small vent. And there, leaning against a target, was the source of the overwhelming sound. Not the music box itself, but the target. It was an old, straw target riddled with holes. And clinging to the center of the bullseye, radiating the painful, manic energy of the music box melody, was a tiny, shimmering particle of pale green light. It was a shard of the shattered vessel. A single, potent echo fragment. As I approached, a new sound began, overlaid on the music box melody. A young girl sobbing, raw and heart-wrenching. The sound was coming from the target, from the echo fragment itself. It wasn't just sound. It was a concentrated burst of emotion. I heard the girl's thoughts, clear as day. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I didn't mean it to be forever. I realized what this echo was. In 1993, there was a tragic accident in this room. A student, overwhelmed by bullying, had rigged a crossbow to a timer and attempted suicide, but the bolt missed, striking and permanently paralyzing a gym teacher. The anguish of the shooter, the intent of the self-destruction, had been harvested by the protocol. The archivist had dispersed this raw guilt echo into the town. I knew I had to contain it. The music box was the key, but the journal was the vessel's control. I opened my grandfather's journal to the brain sketch. I held the page out, aiming the symbol at the shimmering green particle. As the symbol, the frequency tuner, lined up with the echo, the agonizing music box melody in my head softened, replaced by a low, comforting hum. The green light of the echo fragment was slowly, inexorably drawn to the inked symbol on the page that IT didn't absorb into the paper. Instead, as the fragment touched the ink, the shimmering particle vanished, and a single word appeared on the paper, burned into the surface just above the brain's sketch. The music box melody in my head stopped. The profound dread in my chest eased, replaced by a deep, weary satisfaction. I had contained the first dispersed echo, but the silence only lasted for a moment. Then, a new, slightly higher-pitched melody started playing in my head. It was more frantic, more insistent than the last. The new frequency was already pulling me in a different direction, toward the Havenwood docks. Near the abandoned fishing pier, I looked at the journal, now a map of collected trauma. I knew the job was just beginning. The town's suffering was now my burden. I was the protocol. The second melody was a staccato, frantic rhythm, a high-pitched tinkle that echoed the sound of frantic activity and desperation. It pulled me out of the suffocating stillness of the school and toward the cold, salty air of the Havenwood docks. The docks were the town's oldest lifeline, a sprawling expanse of creaking wood, rusty machinery, and the constant, rhythmic sloshing of the Atlantic. The new frequency pulsed in my head, drawing me to the oldest section, Pier 4, abandoned since the fishing industry collapsed 20 years ago. The pier jutted out into the black water, rotting pilings holding up planks slick with mildew and salt. The music box melody was nearly unbearable here, a screaming alarm in my mind that I moved with a new certainty. I was no longer an officer following procedure. I was a hunter following a frequency. The echo was not on the pier itself. It was beneath it that I crept to the end of the pier, peering down into the dark, turbulent water. The music was loudest directly below, near the waterline, clinging to one of the thick, barnacle-encrusted pilings. And there it was, another single, pale green shimmer of light, radiating immense, frantic energy. A second echo fragment that as the light intensified. The music box melody was overlaid with a new sound, a man's heavy, desperate breathing, interspersed with the sharp, metallic crunch of crushing metal. This was the sound of the traumatic event itself. I focused on the echo, letting the memory flood me. The year was 1998. The pier was still active then. A small fishing vessel, owned by a desperate local named Thomas Flynn, was trying to make one last run before a massive hurricane hit. Flynn owed money to the wrong people. He was trying to dump his illegal catch and make a break for it. But his engine failed right here. His boat was crushed between two pilings by the massive, shifting swell. Flynn drowned, leaving behind a young family and a pile of crippling debt. This was the AVARICE echo, the frantic sound of a man sacrificing his life for greed. I opened my grandfather's journal. The second spot on the brain diagram, near the language center, seemed to hum slightly. I aimed the frequency tuner, the complex symbol, at the submerged echo, but before I could draw the fragment to the journal, a figure emerged from the deep shadows between the pilings. It was a man, soaking wet, his clothes clinging to him. He was thin, pale, and his skin was slick with salt water. He wasn't the archivist. This man was wearing a faded, salt-stained fisherman's coat, and his eyes were wide, dark, and utterly vacant. It was Thomas Flynn, the drowned man. The physical manifestation of the AVARICE echo that he floated effortlessly to the surface, his face tilted up toward mine. He didn't look angry. He looked consumed by a manic, desperate energy. Mine, he gargled, his voice a horrifying mixture of water and air. You can't take it. I earned it. My family needs the catch. He lunged. I instinctively backed away, pulling my sidearm. But Flynn wasn't solid. He was a creature of water and psychic energy. His hand passed through the pistol, cold as the sea floor. He was trying to drag me into the water, to consume me and the journal. His touch sent a shock of icy despair through my arm. You're the Echo Protocol now. You feel it. Take my catch. Take my debt. As his other arm reached for the journal, the music box melody in my head reached a terrifying, deafening crescendo that I knew I couldn't shoot him. He wasn't real. But the raw psychic energy he carried was a danger to my control. That I looked at the submerged echo fragment, still shimmering with pure green light. I looked at the screaming manifestation of Flynn. That I acted on instinct, guided by the journal's silent, controlling influence. I didn't try to pull the echo into the journal. I used the journal to push the echo. I slapped the open page, the symbol, onto Flynn's chest. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The AVARICE echo, the frantic green light still clinging to the pylon, shot forward like a bolt of lightning, impacting Thomas Flynn's chest. The music box melody in my head became a horrifying, resonant snare drum, deafeningly loud. Flynn screamed, a sound that wasn't water or air, but the metallic crunch of his boat being crushed amplified. The green light consumed his spectral form, and the figure of Thomas Flynn collapsed violently into the black water, dissolving into nothingness. The agonizing music box frequency immediately dropped to a low, heavy throb. The echo fragment had been contained, but not without a violent psychic backlash. I looked at the journal. The second word had appeared, this time near the speech center of the brain diagram, seared onto the page. Avarice had contained the second echo, but the encounter with the manifested trauma had drained me. I leaned against a cold piling, gasping, the taste of salt and despair thick in my mouth. The momentary silence was brief. A new, extremely slow, melancholic melody started playing in my head. It was a heavy, funereal march. The frequency was low, mournful, and powerful. I didn't need the journal to tell me where it was going. The new frequency was pulling me directly back into the oldest, most sacred ground in Havenwood. It was pulling me back to the old Havenwood cemetery, but to a grave far older and deeper than my grandfather's. The new, melancholic melody in my head was a low, mournful, three-note repetition, like a slow bell tolling. It was heavy with centuries of regret and profound sadness. The frequency was so low it felt like a cold, damp weight pressing on my shoulders. It was leading me directly back to the old Havenwood cemetery. The time was late afternoon. The fog had lifted, but the air was still cold and dense with humidity. I parked the car outside the rusted gates and walked past the fresh, hastily filled-in grave of my grandfather. The music box melody intensified as I walked deeper into the oldest, most neglected section of the cemetery, where the tombstones were crumbling granite slabs from the 1700s, barely legible. The sound reached its peak near the largest, oldest monument, a massive, obelisk-shaped stone, carved not with angels or crosses, but with a stark, archaic depiction of a ship battling a storm. The stone was surrounded by a rusting, wrought iron fence. The stone was dedicated to the town's first mayor and founder, Jonah Havenwood. Died 1799. The inscription was barely readable, but one line was carved much deeper than the rest, as if chiseled later. He sacrificed all for the promise of peace. His silence secured our future. The third echo fragment was here. It clung to the base of the wrought iron fence, a small, vibrant green shimmer pulsating with a slow, powerful rhythm. As I approached the fence, the melancholy melody was overlaid by a new sound, the low, resonant groaning of wood, and the sound of hundreds of people chanting a fearful hymn, their voices thin with starvation and cold. I focused on the echo, letting the history flow through me. The year was 1799. Havenwood had just been founded by Jonah Havenwood, seeking a utopian colony free from the corruption of the cities. But the first winter was brutal. Sickness, starvation, and despair threatened to collapse the colony. The townsfolk were ready to abandon the settlement. Jonah Havenwood, in a desperate bid to save his dream, made a choice. He led a group of dissidents, those who demanded they abandon the town, into the woods under the guise of an expedition. He returned alone, claiming they had left for a better settlement inland. The colony survived that winter, built on the hidden sacrifice of its first lost citizens. This was the founding echo, the profound, melancholy regret of a man who built his peace on a buried lie. The echo was the sound of the victim's final moments, silenced and forgotten by history. I pulled out the journal. The third space on the brain diagram, over the emotional center, seemed to cool slightly. As I prepared to apply the frequency tuner, a shadow detached itself from the back of the massive obelisk. It wasn't a manifestation. It was the archivist, the smiling man, standing perfectly still, watching me. He was wearing the same black coat, and his smile was wider and colder than before. "The melancholic frequency suits you, Ben," the archivist observed, his voice calm, cutting through the spectral chanting. "The vessel should always wear the sorrow of its town." You are becoming very efficient at the protocol. I raised the journal, holding the tuning symbol steady. You want me to collect these echoes for you. Why? If you wanted them contained, you wouldn't have dispersed them. The archivist took a slow, deliberate step toward the fence. Containment is merely phase 1, Ben. You are storing the town's chaos, but that energy must be released in a concentrated burst to achieve its true potential. I dispersed them to make them stronger, to make their collection personal, to tune the final instrument. He gestured to the obelisk. The true reason your grandfather started the protocol was not to cleanse the town, but to empower it. Jonah Havenwood built his town on a lie. Peter Carter built his service on a ritual. Every generation of Havenwood authority has secretly drawn on this hidden energy source to keep the town normal, peaceful, safe. But it always breaks down. He stopped at the wrought iron fence. I am here to ensure that. When you complete the protocol, you understand the purpose of your sacrifice. You are not cleansing the town, Ben. You are creating the next, permanent silence. I felt the immense weight of the collected guilt and avarice in the journal. I knew I couldn't let the melancholic founding echo escape. You're a leech. I spat, holding the journal closer to the fragment. You're feeding off the pain. I am the custodian of the truth, he corrected, his voice hardening. And you are taking too long to collect the fourth, final echo. He did not try to stop me this time. He just watched, his black eyes fixed on the journal that I pressed the carved symbol on the page against the wrought iron, aligning it with the pale green light. The light surged forward, pulled instantly by the tuner. The chanting of the fearful colonists stopped abruptly. The intense melancholy slammed into the journal, and the third word was instantly seared onto the page, near the frontal lobe. The music box melody in my head ceased, replaced by a perfect, profound silence. But the archivist was smiling wider than ever. He wasn't frustrated. He was delighted. The protocol is 3/4 complete, he said, tapping the obelisk lightly. The vessel has accepted its burden. The town's suffering is yours. And now, the final frequency begins. He raised a hand, and the wrought iron fence around Jonah Havenwood's grave began to vibrate, humming with the familiar pale green light. The fence didn't disintegrate like the padlocks. Instead, the iron bars began to twist and reshape themselves, melting into a grotesque, pulsing, three-dimensional rendition of the geometric symbol, the frequency tuner. The fourth echo, the archivist announced, his voice ringing with triumph, is not a place. It is a person, the purest, closest echo of betrayal and hidden pain. He took a step back, now completely outside the transformed fence, which pulsed like a captured heart. You have contained the town's history, Ben. Now you must contain your future. Go to the only place where the town's secrets are still being guarded. The place where the silence is absolute. He pointed toward the town. Find the Havenwood archives. Sarah Vance is waiting. And she is the final echo. The betrayal. With a final, terrible smile, the archivist dissolved into the air, leaving me alone with the silent, humming symbol and the crushing weight of 3 collected traumas burning in the journal in my hands. The silence was broken by a single, terrifying sound emanating from the journal itself. A faint, high-pitched whimper. It was Sarah's fear. The music box melody had changed entirely. It was now a sharp, erratic, desperate rhythm, the sound of a heart beating too fast. The final frequency was active. The archive was next. The rhythmic, frantic pulse in my head, the sound of a terrified, rapidly beating heart, was the new frequency. It was drawing me inexorably towards the final extraction point, the Havenwood Town Archives. The archives weren't in a grand building. They were housed in the basement of the town hall, beneath the police station itself. A narrow, steel door marked Records and Preservation was the only entrance, usually sealed with a thick bar and heavy security padlocks that I sped back to the town hall. The front entrance was still bustling with official confusion over Vance's disappearance and the blackout. I slipped unnoticed around to the back, near the basement access. The steel door to the archives was not locked. The thick metal bar was pulled aside, and the door stood slightly ajar. A final, deliberate invitation from the archivist. The atmosphere in the basement was instantly oppressive. The air was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of old paper and dust. Fluorescent lights flickered sporadically down the long corridor, casting deep, erratic shadows. The frantic pulse in my head was deafening now. It was Sarah's heartbeat, amplified to a terrifying, internal drum solo that I moved through the stacks of cardboard boxes and metal filing cabinets. The floor was concrete, marked with years of scuffs and water stains. I reached the last row of cabinets, and there she was. Sarah Vance was sitting on the floor, huddled against the wall. She was not tied up this time, but her hands were clasped over her ears, tears streaming down her face. The final echo fragment was not shimmering on the wall or on a piece of metal. It was a faint, green pulse radiating from Sarah's chest, right over her heart. It was small, but incredibly potent. "Sarah," I rushed to her, kneeling down. She flinched away, shaking her head violently. "Ben, don't touch me. I hear it. The music, the voices. They're screaming at me." She wasn't hearing the music box melody. She was hearing the massive, contained chaos of the three echoes: guilt, avarice, and sacrifice, vibrating within the journal I held. The final fragment in her chest was resonating with the completed core of the protocol. "Where is he? The archivist?" I demanded, scanning the surrounding shadows. "He's not here," Sarah choked out, pulling her knees to her chest. "He told me to wait. He told me I was part of the intention. He said I was the reason your grandfather started the protocol." She was the betrayal echo, the final piece that I realized the horrifying truth. Sarah wasn't just a victim. She was the granddaughter of Elias Vance, the missing harbor master whose name was carved into the lighthouse. She was the niece of Silas Vance, the archivist's partner in the photograph. Her entire lineage was tied to the creation and maintenance of the protocol that I opened the journal to the anatomical sketch, the symbol glowing faintly, hungry for the final piece. "Sarah, I have to take it. I have to contain the echo. It's the only way to stop him," I said, my voice urgent. She looked at the symbol, then at the green light pulsating over her heart. "He said if you take it, you become the gate. You can't just absorb it, Ben. He said the betrayal is too close. The connection will be permanent. I don't have a choice." As I prepared to press the tuning symbol against the final echo, the air in the archives grew instantly cold. A new sound joined the chaotic, layered whimper and the rapid heartbeat. A familiar, smooth, resonating voice that wasn't physical. It was coming from the air, from the walls, from the very dust in the archives. It was the voice of the archivist, everywhere and nowhere. "Correct, Sarah. The vessel is ready for permanent connection. Ben, you've collected the raw agony of Havenwood. Now, take the final, necessary sting, the echo of betrayal. The knowledge that the person you trusted most was compromised." Then, another voice joined in. A familiar, gravelly voice. "Captain Vance. Ben, he's lying. Don't take it. Sarah is the key, but not the echo." The voice was faint, distorted as if coming from the far side of a massive wall, a trapped transmission. The archivist's voice immediately drowned it out, laced with venom. "Silence, Elias. Your sacrifice was for nothing. Ben, look at her. The police logs, the coordinates, the untraceable calls. Who else had access to all of it? Who else knew exactly when to route your calls to me?" I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were fixed on the green pulse in her chest. She wasn't fighting the accusation. "Ben," Sarah whispered, her voice defeated. "When the first call came in, the abnormal vocalizations, I didn't just route it to you because you were closest. I amplified the sound. I rerouted the frequency to the lighthouse. I didn't know why, but Silas, my uncle, the archivist, he told me to be ready for the signal. He said the town needed cleansing." She dissolved into quiet sobs. "I didn't know it was real until the music box started playing in my head after the lighthouse. I was the archivist's control link. I guided you. I am the betrayal." I felt sick. The person I trusted, the person I protected, was the willing, if unwitting, instrument of the man who had stolen the peace of my town and the life of my friend, Captain Vance. The green light over Sarah's heart intensified, the ultimate concentration of emotional agony. The final echo. I raised the journal. I had to end this. "I am sorry, Sarah," I whispered, focusing the symbol. "But the protocol ends here." As the symbol neared her chest, the light pulsed fiercely. The final, fourth word seared itself onto the journal, but not on the brain diagram. It was written in the blank space beside the diagram, in a thick, dark substance that smelled like ozone and blood. All the agonizing, Rapid heartbeat in my head stopped. The chaotic whispering ceased. The silence in the archives was absolute. I looked at the journal. For echoes contained. The protocol was complete, but Sarah was still sitting there, silent, the faint green light still pulsing over her heart. The echo hadn't been fully contained. The archivist's voice returned, triumphant. Yes, the final word. The intention is complete. Ben Carter, you are now the full vessel. The gate. The entire psychic trauma of Havenwood is yours. The floor began to vibrate violently. The lights went out completely, plunging us into absolute darkness. And now, the archivist bellowed, his voice vibrating the very air. You will release the energy back into the town. You are the bomb, Ben. You will achieve the ultimate, permanent silence. A massive, invisible force slammed into my chest. A spiritual surge of energy aimed at pushing the contained chaos in the journal out of me and into the town. I staggered back, hitting a metal filing cabinet. But as the force hit me, I didn't feel the compulsion to release the energy. I felt the collective intention of the 4 words in the journal: guilt, avarice, sacrifice, betrayal. The crushing weight of the town's history that I had absorbed the echoes. Now I had the intention. I raised the journal, holding it over my head like a shield. No, I shouted into the darkness. The protocol doesn't end with a bang. It ends with containment. I slammed the open, inscribed journal face down onto the concrete floor of the Havenwood archives, exactly where the symbols had formed the first time. The journal hit the concrete with a sound that felt like a bell tolling across the town. A massive wave of pale green light surged out of the journal, rushing across the concrete floor and sinking into the earth, followed by a low, powerful, sustained hum. The building groaned. The entire town hall, police station, archives, and all shook violently. The archivist screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated pain and fury. No, you sealed it. You used the final intention against me. You trapped the echoes below the line. The force pinning me vanished. The temperature returned to normal. The emergency lights in the corridor immediately kicked on. I looked down at the journal. It was pressed into the concrete floor, fused to the stone, humming with a low, eternal frequency. The symbols were glowing, not fading, but contained. Sarah rushed to me, terrified. What did you do? I looked at the fused journal, now the permanent foundation of the town's trauma, sealed beneath its seat of power. The intention of the journal was to contain the echoes, I said, utterly exhausted. My grandfather was right. The silence isn't permanent. It just needs a guardian. And the town hall, now it's the gate. We sealed the chaos beneath the police station. The archivist was gone. The only things left were the faint scent of ozone and the silent promise of a return. I looked at Sarah, the girl who had betrayed me, who was also a victim. The final echo was sealed, but its memory was still alive. I reached for my radio, the final decision clear. The official version of events would be confusion, a chemical attack, and a massive cover-up. The protocol was over, but the echo was not. The official report on the events of the last 72 hours was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation. Deputy Chief Jenkins, eager to restore order and bury the impossible, concluded that the incidents, the lighthouse fire, the power surge at the Kellar farm and the town hall, the discovery of the antique journal, were the result of a coordinated domestic terrorist attack by an unknown, highly resourceful cult obsessed with Havenwood's maritime history. Captain Vance was listed as missing, presumed a victim of the cult. His brother, Silas, was never mentioned. The fact that the massive, complex journal was now fused to the concrete foundation of the archives was explained away as an unexploded custom device, neutralized by a heroic, quick-thinking Officer Carter, who was subsequently given 3 weeks paid leave for exposure to chemical agents and extreme psychological stress. Sarah Vance was cleared, her role as dispatcher deemed critical, though she was immediately transferred to a different precinct 3 states away, a final, necessary excision of the betrayal echo from Havenwood. That I didn't argue the report. I accepted the lie because the truth was far worse. The truth was sealed beneath the archives, and I was its permanent, psychological guardian. The permanent vessel card file box. 3 months after the protocol was sealed, I returned to duty, but I was no longer the same cop. I was the vessel, the weight of the contained echoes, Guilt, avarice, sacrifice, and betrayal was a constant, cold pressure in my skull. I didn't just feel empathy for the townspeople. I felt their raw, historical pain. When a woman reported a lost dog, I smelled the sulfurous smoke of the lighthouse tragedy. When an old man confessed to an insurance scam, I heard the frantic, drowning breaths of Thomas Flynn at the docks. Every interaction was a sensory overload, a constant awareness of the terrible things people had done and suffered in Havenwood. The most profound change, however, was the silence. The music box melody was gone, replaced by the low, continuous, heavy hum that emanated from the journal sealed beneath the archives. The hum was the sound of the contained chaos, and it was the sound of my life that I realized the archivist's final, chilling truth. My containment of the echoes was a double-edged sword. I hadn't destroyed the protocol. I had simply internalized and stabilized it. I was the living filter, the human gate that kept Havenwood safe. And my sanity was the toll that I still wore the uniform. But my policing changed. I didn't patrol, I managed. I steered clear of potential crime scenes that would generate new, powerful psychic trauma, lest they overload the fragile equilibrium of the sealed journal. I became a master of deflection, subtly pushing dangerous situations outside of town limits, or mitigating them before they could reach a critical, echo-generating point. The archivist's lesson candle, I knew the archivist, Silas Vance, wasn't truly gone. He was a master manipulator, and he had simply retreated to rebuild his network, likely using the initial dispersion of the echoes to recruit new, unwitting subjects across the East Coast. But a crucial piece of evidence remained hidden in my apartment. The final music box he had used to broadcast the sacrifice echo, the one I had left on my side table point one night, driven by the oppressive hum. I brought the small, wooden box out. It was silent, inert. I knew it was the frequency anchor. I knew the archivist would return for it eventually, or use its twin to reactivate the protocol that I examined it. Running my finger over the smooth, dark wood, I noticed a tiny, almost invisible inscription carved beneath the winding mechanism hesitant face to V. Selim Mxis, Silas Vance. Mxi, 2013. But Siwem? I ran the initials through police codes, military abbreviations, and finally, my grandfather's journaled in the deepest, most arcane notes of Peter Carter's journal. Among the sketches of ley lines and frequency diagrams, there was a single, annotated phrase seed O.M. Custodes Orbis. Mortis, the guardians of the dead world. The archivist wasn't a lone cultist. He was part of an organized, generational society dedicated to the cleansing of historically significant, traumatized locations. He was a guardian, and his final act of fury confirmed one more thing about his plan. The sealed journal, my personal trauma, was now transmitting a low, powerful signal. It wasn't just containing chaos. It was passively broadcasting my identity as the new vessel to the entire COM network. The archivist had failed to make me a weapon, but he had succeeded in making me a target and a replacement. The first test telephone receiver 6 months passed. The town was abnormally quiet. Too quiet. One Tuesday morning, at 3:17, the exact time of the first call to the Kellar farm. The emergency line in the station rang. I was the only one on duty. I answered the phone. The line was static, crackling with a distorted, high-pitched whine. Then, a voice cut through the static, cold and mechanical, clearly digitally synthesized. It wasn't the archivist, but a voice from his network. The vessel's signal is confirmed. The frequency is stable. Havenwood is quiet. The protocol works. A moment of silence, and then the mechanical voice delivered the final, bone-chilling message. A new frequency aimed directly at the permanent echo now stored in my consciousness. Our work requires a new gate. We are coming to collect the music box, Officer Carter, and you will be reassigned. The line clicked dead, but the chaotic, high-pitched whine of the static remained, now a faint, agonizing overlay to the continuous hum of the sealed protocol beneath my feet. The silence was over. The guardians of the dead world were coming for their new gate. The mechanical voice on the phone, the chilling confirmation that the archivist's organization, the Custodes Orbis Mortis, COM, was aware of my containment and intended to collect me, was the jolt I needed. The 3 weeks of mandated leave had given me time to internalize the protocol. The 6 months of silence had given me control. Now, the threat of the Guardians' arrival galvanized me into action. They wanted the music box, the frequency anchor. They wanted me, the gate, infused with the psychic trauma of Havenwood. I would give them neither. That my plan was simple, desperate, and reliant on a final, profound betrayal of the very silence I had struggled to maintain. Preparation gear, I spent the next 48 hours in the archive's basement, feigning inventory duty. I was alone with the journal, fused into the concrete floor, humming its low, steady frequency that I couldn't remove the journal, but I could interact with it. I retrieved the music box, the archivist's frequency anchor, and placed it directly over the journal's exposed pages. The symbols on the journal, the words guilt, avarice, sacrifice, betrayal, seemed to pulse in response to the my objective. Use the music box, not as an anchor for the archivist's frequency, but as a resonator for the journal's contained trauma. I was going to turn the Guardian's tool into the gate's weapon. I used a small, diamond-tipped drill bit, borrowed indefinitely from the maintenance shed, to carefully drill a single, microscopic hole in the wood of the music box, directly above the mechanism. It was a risky move, creating a weak point that would allow the sheer, concentrated power of the sealed echoes to vent, not gently into the town, but violently at a specific target. The ambush kitchen knife. They came at 3:17 on a cold Friday night, exactly 1 week after the warning call that I was waiting for them in the archives. The power in the entire town hall was cut, save for a single emergency lantern placed near the fusion point. The glowing journal and the silent music box. Two figures entered the basement. They were not Silas Vance. They were younger, wearing heavy, anonymous black coats, their faces obscured by deep shadow. They moved with the same unsettling, quiet efficiency as the archivist, armed not with guns, but with strange, cylindrical metal instruments that hummed faintly. "The gate is operational," one of them hissed, his voice dry and devoid of emotion. "Confirmed echo signature stable." They didn't look at me. They only looked at the journal and the music box. They assumed the vessel, me, was docile, waiting to be reassigned. As they reached the lantern, I stepped out of the deep shadows of the filing cabinets, holding my standard-issue Havenwood PD taser, set to maximum charge. "The protocol is closed," I said, my voice echoing in the darkness. "The gate is sealed." The first Guardian reacted instantly, raising his humming device. It emitted a thin, pale green beam aimed at my chest. It wasn't kinetic. It was a frequency, a focused beam of psychic paralysis that I felt the immense, cold pressure of the beam hitting me, the familiar sensation of pure dread. But the contained echoes within me, the accumulated avarice and guilt, acted as a psychic shield. The beam stalled, fracturing against the immense, internalized pain that I didn't hesitate. I fired the taser. Zap. The high-voltage charge hit the Guardian square in the chest. He convulsed and dropped his humming device. But the taser couldn't take him down. His body was already vibrating with a subtle, controlled energy, the same barrier that protected Silas Vance from my bullet. However, the immense electrical current did what my bullet couldn't. It momentarily disrupted the Guardian's internal frequency control. A ripple of pale green light surged over his body, and he stumbled backward into the wall. The second Guardian lunged at me, his eyes glowing faintly with the same black, empty look as the archivist that I didn't fight him. I threw myself past him, toward the fusion point, the journal and the music box, the reckoning. Collision. I reached the music box, seized it, and threw myself back into the shadows. The two Guardians converged on the empty spot. "He has the anchor," the first one yelled, his voice recovering. "Do not let him use the frequency." I ignored them. I didn't need to play the music box. I just needed to break it. I pulled the music box to my shoulder, lining up the microscopic hole with the approaching Guardians. I didn't have a final, magical weapon. I had one final act of desperation. I brought the heel of my boot down with all the strength my exhausted body could muster, crushing the exposed winding mechanism of the music box. The sound was instantaneous, deafening, and absolute. Instead of a delicate tinkle, the music box exploded in a blinding flash of concentrated, raw, pale green light. The energy was not the focused echo of sacrifice or betrayal. It was the explosive, uncontained total sum of all four echoes, venting instantly through the weak point I had drilled, the burst of psychic trauma. The concentrated memory, frequency, resonance, and intention slammed into the two guardians like 1,000 years of accumulated guilt and agony made physical. They didn't scream. They didn't fall. They simply dematerialized. The energy ripped them apart at the molecular, psychic level. For a horrifying second, the air was filled with the collective sound of 1,000 crushed bones, 1,000,000 whispered regrets, and the final, dying roar of Captain Vance, all condensed into a single, overwhelming sonic wave. Then, silence. A ringing, painful, absolute silence. When my eyes cleared, the archives were intact, save for the area around the journal. The two guardians were gone. Only 2 scorch marks remained on the concrete floor where they had stood, and 2 piles of fine, gray dust, identical to the dust left by the disintegrated padlocks at the lighthouse. The music box was a splintered ruin that I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, my body aching, my mind ringing from the psychic discharge. The oppressive hum of the sealed journal beneath me was now low, almost soothing. The gate was safe. The new protocol dove. I never saw the archivist, Silas Vance, again. I knew he was still out there, searching for a new frequency anchor, waiting for the massive energy burst to stabilize into a new signal he could track. But I had bought Havenwood time. I returned to duty, maintaining the lie. The official report stated that 2 bodies were found, victims of a rare, instantaneous lightning strike, in the basement during the blackout. That I continued my work, now less a police officer and more a custodian of the town's silence. The weight of the echoes remained, but the contained power gave me an unnerving advantage. I didn't need a taser or a gun anymore. My simple, focused intention, the protection of Havenwood's peace, was a palpable force that could deter minor conflicts before they began. The protocol had truly become me. I was the last line of defense against the overwhelming psychic chaos of the past. Every day was a struggle to keep the hum steady, to keep the silence absolute. 1 year later, a package arrived at my empty house. It was a small, plain wooden box, identical in size and shape to the one I had destroyed. It was empty, but carved into the lid was a single, fresh inscription, not in the archivist's usual block print, but in a delicate, careful script. The gate is beautiful, Ben, but the silence is only temporary. I will return when you falter. I closed the box. I didn't flinch. I walked to the window, watching the silent, fog-laced streets of Havenwood. I knew the job would never end. The moment my vigilance failed, the moment I allowed a new, powerful trauma to shatter the seal, the archivist would walk through the newly opened gate that I was no longer Officer Ben Carter. I was the vessel, and the final, ultimate horror was the realization that the only way to save my town was to constantly carry the full weight of its agony.